The alarms on Haveth Station were screaming before I even opened my eyes. I am Sira Vantral, a signal officer of the Corvain, and on the night everything changed, I was 300 hours into a shift that should have ended peacefully. Instead, I woke to red light flooding my quarters and the deck shaking under my feet like the station itself was trying to run away. Sira, get to the tower now. My supervisor's voice cracked through my comm, thin with fear he was trying to hide. The swarm broke through the outer marker. They are coming in fast. I did not stop to dress properly. I pulled on my uniform jacket over my sleep clothes and ran through corridors filled with other Corvain doing the same, feathers ruffled with panic, wings pressed tight against their bodies because there was no room to spread them here. We were a people built for open skis, trapped in metal tubes, waiting for monsters to arrive. The Asheville swarm did not knock. They did not send warnings. They simply came, in numbers too large to count, ships that looked more like teeth than vessels, and wherever they landed, nothing organic was left standing. Haveth was the 7th border world they had reached this year. 6 others were already gone, their populations either dead or worse, taken to feed whatever hunger drove the swarm forward. I reached the signal tower and dropped into my chair, hands already moving across the controls before my mind had fully caught up with what was happening. On the main screen, sensor readings painted a picture I did not want to see. Dozens of swarm ships, closing on our position from 3 directions, moving with the horrible, patient certainty of predators who already knew they had won. "Status," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Outer defense platforms are down," came the reply from Tactical. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they reach the station itself." 20 minutes. I had run every calculation I knew, checked every channel, and there was no fleet close enough to help us. The Standing Circle, the alliance of worlds I had sworn to serve, had ships fighting on a dozen other fronts, all of them losing ground. Haveth was not important enough to save. We both knew it, even if no one said it out loud. My commanding officer, an older Corvain named Illith Rook, stepped up beside me, her feathers gray with age and stress. She had fought in 3 wars before this one and had the scars along her wingtips to prove it. "Send the standard distress call," she said. "All frequencies. Someone might hear it in time to warn the next world." I did as she asked, my fingers flying over the console, broadcasting our position and our fate to anyone who might be listening. But even as I sent it, I knew it would not save us. It was a warning for the future, not a rescue for the present. Then I remembered something. Buried deep in the old archives, in files most officers were told never to open, there was a frequency that predated the war, predated even the Standing Circle's current charter. It belonged to a species that had been quarantined centuries ago, sealed away behind warning beacons and old fear, a species so violent that our ancestors decided the galaxy was safer without them in it. Humans. I had read the reports as a cadet, late at night when I could not sleep, stories meant to frighten young officers into obedience. Stories of a world so hostile that everything on it had evolved to kill everything else, and somehow, against all sense, intelligent creatures had risen from that chaos anyway. The reports called them unpredictable, dangerous, not to be trusted with modern weapons, let alone an invitation to the wider galaxy. I looked at the timer counting down on my screen. 18 minutes. I looked at Illith Rook, who was already turning away to help evacuate what few escape pods we had. I made my choice in less than a second, the kind of choice you only understand fully after it is already done. I opened the old channel. My hands trembled as I typed the activation sequence, half expecting the system to reject me, to flag me as a traitor to protocol. Instead, the ancient frequency lit up on my display, waiting, patient, as if it had been sitting there for centuries with nothing to do but wait for someone desperate enough to use it. "This is Signal Officer Sira Vantral of Haveth Station," I said, my voice carrying more fear than I wanted it to. "We are under attack by the Asheville swarm. Our defenses are failing. If anyone receives this signal, we request immediate assistance. We have civilians aboard. We have children aboard." I did not know if anyone would hear it. I did not know if the frequency still connected to anything at all, or if I was simply screaming into an empty room that had been abandoned long ago. The swarm ships grew larger on my screen, close enough now that I could make out individual vessels, their jagged shapes catching the light of Haveth's dying sun. Around me, the station's emergency systems continued their countdown, red numbers falling steadily toward 0. 15 minutes. Sira, Illith's voice again, softer this time. Get to the pods, there is nothing more you can do here. I am not leaving my post, I said, and I meant it, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to fly, to escape, to survive. Corvain are not warriors by nature. We are watchers, listeners, the ones who send the warnings so that others might live. But someone had to stay and keep the channel open in case, by some impossible chance, someone answered. 12 minutes. The first wave of swarm fighters broke away from the main formation, streaking toward our outer hull. I watched the tactical display light up with impact warnings, felt the station shudder as automated defenses fired their last desperate shots. We were not going to hold. Everyone in that tower knew it. I could see it in the way the younger officers had stopped checking their instruments and started simply staring at the screens, waiting. And then, 10 minutes before the swarm would have reached us, something changed. A new signal appeared on my display, buried in static, distorted by distance and time, but unmistakably real. It was not a standing circle frequency. It was not anything I recognized from any known fleet in our records. It was rough, almost crude compared to our own elegant communication protocols, but it was there, and it was responding. Unknown station, this is Fleet Command. The voice that came through was strange to my ears, low and rough in a way no Corvain voice could ever be. We read your distress call. Hold position. We are already moving. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was hearing. Illith Rook had gone very still beside me, her feathers flat against her body in a posture I had never seen her use before, one that in Corvain body language meant something close to disbelief. Identify yourself, I said, because it was the only thing I could think to say. There was a pause, filled with more static, and then the voice returned, and this time I could hear something else underneath the roughness. Something that sounded almost like grim amusement. You called the old number, the voice said. Nobody's called that number in a long time. We're the ones your ancestors locked out of the neighborhood. Guess things got bad enough that you needed us after all. I did not know what to say. Around me, the tower had gone completely silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant tremor of the swarm's approach. Every officer in that room understood exactly what those words meant, even if none of us wanted to believe it. The humans were coming. How far are you? I asked, my voice barely steady. Closer than you think, the voice answered. We've had ships stationed near the old quarantine border for longer than you'd guess. Some of us never stopped watching this part of space, even after your people asked us to leave. Sit tight. Keep that channel open. And whatever you do, do not let your defense grid power down completely. We're going to need something to lock onto when we arrive. 8 minutes remained on the countdown, and the swarm's leading ships were now close enough that I could see them without instruments, dark shapes crawling across the edge of Haveth's system like a stain spreading across clean water. I did not know if help would arrive in time. I did not know if what was coming would be any better than what already threatened us. All I knew was that for the first time since the alarms had woken me, there was something other than despair in the tower. There was a question, and somehow that question felt like hope. Illith Rook leaned toward me, her voice low enough that only I could hear it over the growing noise of the room. Do you understand what you have done, Sira? You have opened a door that our people sealed for good reason, centuries ago. I understand that we were about to die, I said, and now we might not. She did not answer, but she did not order me to close the channel either. Instead, she turned back to the tactical display, watching the swarms approach with new tension in her stance, waiting, like the rest of us, to see which kind of monster would reach us first. 6 minutes. The swarm's forward ships began firing on our outer defenses, and the station rocked violently, throwing loose equipment across the tower floor. Somewhere below us, I heard the distant screams of the evacuation alarms, civilians being herded toward what few pods remained. most of them knowing there would not be enough room for everyone. I stayed at my station, one hand braced against the console to keep from falling, the other still holding the old channel open, broadcasting our position into the dark, hoping that whatever was coming would arrive before there was nothing left to save. 4 minutes. "Talk to me," I said into the comm, needing something, anything, to hold onto besides the countdown. "Tell me you are close." The voice that answered this time was different, younger, sharper, cutting through the static with an urgency that matched my own. "We're closer than we've ever been to anything that mattered," it said. "Hang on, Haveth Station. You are not dying today, not on our watch." 2 minutes. The swarm's main formation began its final approach, hundreds of ships converging on our position like a closing fist. I watched the numbers fall on my screen, watched the tactical display fill with hostile contacts, watched everything I had ever known narrow down to this single, impossible moment. And then space itself seemed to tear open along the edge of the system, and something new arrived among the stars. Light bent around shapes that should not have been able to move as fast as they did, and then the human fleet was simply there, filling my screen with contacts that made no sense according to anything I had studied at the Academy. Corvine ships are built for grace. Long, curved hulls that move like birds through open air, weapons mounted to strike quickly and retreat before the enemy can respond. Every vessel in the standing circle follows some version of that same philosophy: elegance over brute strength, precision over power. What appeared above Haveth Station looked nothing like that at all. The human ships were blunt, heavy, covered in plating that seemed almost too thick for their engines to carry. They had none of the smooth lines I associated with proper starship design. Instead, they looked like they had been built by someone who expected to be hit, and hit hard, and simply did not care as long as the ship kept moving afterward. For one terrible second, as I stared at those crude shapes tearing into the system, I thought we had made a mistake far worse than staying silent. I thought we had called in monsters to save us from monsters. Then the human fleet opened fire on the swarm, and I understood why the reports had called them dangerous. There was no hesitation, no warning shots, no attempt at communication with the enemy, nothing resembling the careful tactical maneuvering that standing circle fleets practiced for years before ever seeing actual combat. The human ships simply drove straight into the heart of the swarm formation and began tearing it apart from the inside, weapons fire lighting up the darkness in patterns too fast for me to track. "Sira, look at this," said one of the junior officers beside me, her voice hushed with something between horror and awe. On the tactical display, 3 swarm capital ships, vessels that had taken down 2 standing circle cruisers just weeks earlier, were already crumbling under concentrated human fire. It was not the careful, calculated destruction I was used to seeing in standing circle engagements. It was fast, brutal, and almost frighteningly efficient, like watching a storm tear through a forest, indifferent to what stood in its way. "This is Fleet Command to Haveth Station." The rough voice returned over the comm, calmer now, almost casual despite the chaos unfolding around us. "We're pushing the swarm back from your position. Keep your people calm and stay off the open channels unless it's an emergency. We've got this handled." I could not find words to respond right away. Around me, the tower had fallen into stunned silence, every officer watching the same impossible sight, ships that should not have been able to fight the way they were fighting, doing exactly that. "Confirmed," I finally managed. "Thank you." "Don't thank us yet," the voice replied. "This fight isn't over, just getting started." Over the next several minutes, I watched something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The human fleet did not fight the way our tacticians had trained us to expect an enemy might fight, not with cold calculation or perfect formations, but with something closer to controlled fury. They took hits that would have crippled a Corvine vessel and kept firing. They pushed their ships into positions that any of our commanders would have called suicidal, closing the distance with swarm capital ships instead of maintaining safe range, trading precision for raw, overwhelming force. And it worked. Within 20 minutes, the swarm's forward assault had been broken entirely. The remaining enemy ships scattered, retreating in directions that made little tactical sense, as if the very presence of the human fleet had shattered whatever coordination held the swarm together. I had never seen the Asheville retreat before. In every previous engagement I had studied, they fought until every ship was destroyed. They did not know how to stop. But they knew how to run from this. "Swarm forces withdrawing," reported tactical disbelief clear in every word. "They are leaving the system." Illith Rook let out a long breath beside me, the kind of exhale that carries weeks of held tension with it. "In 60 years of service," she said quietly, "I have never seen anything retreat from the Asheville swarm. Not once." I found myself staring at the tactical display, watching the human fleet regroup in the space where dozens of enemy ships had been just half an hour earlier. There were losses on their side, too. I could see gaps in their formation, ships that had been there at the start of the engagement and were simply gone now. But they had won. Against odds that should have been impossible, they had won, and Haveth Station still stood. "Haveth Station, this is Fleet Command." The voice returned, steadier now, and I thought I could hear something like relief in it, buried under the roughness. "System is clear for now. We're sending a shuttle over for damage assessment and to open direct communication, requesting permission to dock." I looked at Illith Rook, who nodded once, still watching the screen as if she expected the human ships to vanish as suddenly as they had appeared. "Permission granted," I said, "and Fleet Command, thank you, truly." "Just doing what needed doing," came the reply. "See you soon, Officer Vantrell." They had learned my name from the open channel, I realized, somewhere in the chaos of the battle. It felt strange, hearing it spoken in that rough, unfamiliar voice, like a word borrowed from a language I did not fully understand yet. 2 hours later, I stood in the station's main receiving bay, waiting alongside Illith Rook and a handful of other senior officers as the promised shuttle completed its docking sequence. My feathers were still ruffled from the stress of the attack, and I had not slept properly, but none of that mattered as much as the questions sitting heavy in my chest. What would they actually look like, these creatures our ancestors had feared enough to quarantine? The shuttle's hatch opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the first human I ever saw stepped through it. He was shorter than I expected, though still taller than most Corvain, built with a solidity that seemed almost unnecessary, as if his body had been designed to absorb impacts rather than avoid them. His skin was a warm brown, his dark hair cut close to his scalp, and he wore a uniform that looked practical rather than ceremonial, patched in places where newer fabric had been sewn over old damage. When he looked at us, his eyes were sharp, assessing, but not unkind. "Daniel Cross," he said, extending a hand in a gesture I did not immediately understand. "Fleet Commander, you must be the officer who sent the call." I looked at Illith Rook, unsure how to respond to the strange gesture, and she gave a small nod, encouraging me to speak. "Sira Vantrell," I said. "Signal officer, yes, I sent it." Daniel's expression shifted into something that took me a moment to recognize as a smile. It was not the polite, careful expression Corvain used in formal meetings. It was warmer, more direct. Like he genuinely meant it, rather than simply performing politeness. "Good instincts," he said. "That old frequency's been quiet for a long time. Took guts to use it, knowing what your people probably taught you about us." "We were told you were dangerous," I admitted, because there seemed little point in pretending otherwise. "Violent, not to be trusted." "We are dangerous," Daniel said, without any hesitation or offense in his voice. "That part's true, but dangerous isn't the same as untrustworthy. We just pointed at the right targets." Behind him, more humans began filing out of the shuttle, and I found myself studying each one with the same mixture of caution and fascination. They moved differently than Corvain, heavier on their feet, less concerned with the careful, measured grace that defined so much of our own culture. Some of them were laughing quietly with each other despite the battle that had just ended, a kind of easy familiarity that suggested they had faced worse together many times before. One of them, a woman with pale hair pulled back tightly and a long scar running along her jaw, stepped up beside Daniel and studied the receiving bay with obvious professional interest. "Grace Holloway," she introduced herself. "Chief Engineer. Your station took some hits during the fight. I'd like to take a look at your damaged systems if that's permitted." "Of course," Ilithrook said, finally finding her voice. "We are grateful for your assistance in every way." Grace nodded, already turning to survey the bay's structural supports with a practiced eye. "We'll get you patched up. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold." Over the following hour, as human crew members spread through the station to assist with repairs and check on the wounded, I stayed close to Daniel Cross, partly out of duty, and partly because I could not stop myself from wanting to understand these creatures better. Everything about them contradicted what I had been taught. They fought with terrifying efficiency, yet treated the Corvain survivors with genuine gentleness, carrying injured civilians with a careful strength that surprised me every time I witnessed it. "Can I ask you something?" I said, as we walked together toward the tower where the battle had first been tracked. "Go ahead." "Why did you come? We are not your people. Our ancestors quarantined yours. You owed us nothing." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he watched a group of his crew, helping a young Corvain family toward temporary shelter. "Where I'm from," he said finally, "there's an old idea. When someone's drowning, you don't stop to ask if they'd have done the same for you. You just pull them out of the water. Maybe that's not smart. Maybe it gets people killed sometimes. But it's who we are, and honestly, it's probably the only reason we're worth having around." I did not have an answer for that. I simply walked beside him in silence, trying to reconcile the violent, unpredictable reputation of his species with the man standing next to me, who had risked his ships and his crew to save a station full of strangers who had feared him before they had even met him. Somewhere behind us, Grace Holloway's voice carried across the bay, calling instructions to her repair team, mixed with easy laughter despite the exhaustion clear in every human face I passed. It was strange, watching creatures capable of such overwhelming violence move through the aftermath of battle with something that looked almost like tenderness. I did not understand humanity yet. Not really. But standing there in the ruins of what should have been Haveth's final hour, watching them work to save what remained of my home, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever they were not the monsters our ancestors had warned us about. Or if they were monsters who had chosen, for reasons I did not yet fully grasp, to stand between us and something far worse. That understanding would only grow stronger over the weeks that followed, as I found myself assigned, almost by accident, to serve as a liaison between my people and the strange, contradictory fleet that had saved us. 3 weeks after the battle at Haveth, I received orders that surprised me more than the arrival of the human fleet ever had. Ilithrook called me into her office, her feathers smoothed into the formal posture she reserved for serious matters, and told me that Standing Circle Command wanted a Corvain liaison assigned directly to the human fleet, someone to observe, translate, and help coordinate the growing partnership between our peoples. "They asked for you by name," she said. "Commander Cross specifically requested it." I had not expected that, though perhaps I should have. In the weeks since the battle, Daniel and I had spoken often, comparing notes on tactics, culture, and the strange gaps in understanding between our species. I had grown comfortable in his presence, comfortable enough that the idea of living aboard a human vessel no longer filled me with the same fear it once might have. Still, nothing could have fully prepared me for what daily life among humans actually looked like. The ship I was assigned to was called the Ember Queen, a mid-sized cruiser that served as Daniel's mobile command post as the human fleet continued pushing back the Asheville swarm across the border systems. From the outside, it looked exactly as blunt and heavy as every other human vessel I had seen, but stepping aboard for the first time revealed something I had not expected. Despite its rough exterior, the ship's interior felt lived in, almost warm, decorated with small personal touches that had nothing to do with military function. Photographs pinned to walls, hand-drawn pictures taped near crew quarters, clearly made by children somewhere far away. A single, battered guitar resting in the corner of the mess hall, clearly well used. "You get used to the noise," Grace Holloway told me on my first full day aboard, noticing my flinch as two crew members nearly collided in the corridor while laughing loudly about something I did not understand. "We're not big on quiet. Corvine ships are quiet, right? Everything measured, everything careful." "Yes," I admitted. "Our ships are built around discipline, precision." "Our ships are built around people who'd rather die together loudly than survive alone quietly," Grace said, not unkindly. "Different philosophy, I guess." I began keeping a private log during those early days, partly for my official reports to Standing Circle Command, and partly because I found myself needing to process what I was witnessing. Humanity, I quickly learned, was full of contradictions that seemed to make no sense individually, but somehow worked together into something functional, even admirable. They ate foods that would have been dangerous for most Standing Circle species, spiced dishes so intense that the smell alone made my eyes water, and yet they showed genuine concern when preparing meals for me, carefully researching what Corvine biology could safely process. They slept through minor hull tremors and equipment malfunctions that would have sent Corvine crews into emergency protocols, dismissing such things as nothing to worry about. And yet they reacted with immediate, focused urgency the moment any actual danger appeared, snapping from relaxed indifference to sharp readiness faster than I had ever seen any species manage. "You're starring again," Daniel said one evening, finding me watching a group of off-duty crew members playing some kind of loud, physical game in the ship's small recreation area, shouting and laughing as they moved. "I am trying to understand," I admitted. "On Haveth, after a difficult mission, our people rest quietly, reflect, this is." "Chaos," Daniel offered, amused. "I was going to say lively," I said carefully, "but chaos may also apply." He laughed, the sound easy and genuine, and gestured for me to join him at a nearby table. "It's how we handle stress, I think. Where we come from, things go wrong constantly. Storms, sickness, just plain bad luck. You learn pretty quick that if you don't find joy in the small moments, you'll never find it at all. So we get loud. We laugh too much. We tell bad jokes at the worst possible times. It's not disrespect for the danger. It's just refusing to let the danger own every part of us." I thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind the way I might examine an unfamiliar piece of technology, trying to understand its function. Corvine culture valued restraint above almost everything else. We believed that discipline in small moments led to discipline in large ones, that quiet minds made for quick, precise decisions in crisis. Watching the human crew, I began to suspect they had reached the same conclusion through an entirely different path. Using noise and laughter as their own form of discipline, a way of keeping their minds sharp and their spirits unbroken despite everything the galaxy threw at them. Not everything I witnessed was comfortable to watch, however. 2 weeks into my assignment aboard the Ember Queen, the fleet encountered a swarm scouting group near a mining colony called Farron's Hollow, a small, mostly forgotten outpost with barely enough population to justify its own name. Standing Circle Command had already written the colony off as indefensible, too remote, too small to justify the resources needed to properly protect it. Daniel did not hesitate. "We're diverting," he announced during the tactical briefing, ignoring the immediate objections from 2 of his senior officers. "That colony's got families in it. We can reach them before the swarm scouts report back to their main force." "Sir, with respect," said one of the officers, a tall man named Owen Pierce, who served as the ship's tactical coordinator, "that colony isn't part of our current mandate. Standing Circle Command marked it as a loss weeks ago." "Standing Circle Command isn't here," Daniel replied evenly. "We are set a course." I watched this exchange with growing fascination, comparing it silently to how Corvine command structures typically operated. In our fleets, orders from Central Command were rarely questioned, and deviation from an approved mandate, even for compassionate reasons, would have required extensive review and justification. Daniel made his decision in less than a minute, based entirely on the simple fact that people needed help, and he had the ability to provide it. The battle at Farron's Hollow was smaller than the engagement at Haveth, but no less intense. I stood in the Ember Queen's observation deck, watching human ships weave between mining platforms and swarm fighters, protecting evacuation shuttles as they ferried terrified colonists to safety. It was during this engagement that I witnessed something that would stay with me long after the fighting ended. One of the evacuation shuttles suffered critical engine failure mid-flight, stranding nearly 40 colonists in open space with swarm fighters closing fast and no working propulsion to escape. I heard the panicked communication over the fleet's open channel, the shuttle pilot's voice cracking as she reported their position and the impossible odds against them. Without waiting for orders, a smaller human vessel called the Halberds Grace broke formation and drove directly into the path of the approaching swarm fighters, placing itself between the enemy and the stranded shuttle. I watched on the tactical display as the Halberds Grace took hit after hit, its shields failing, its hull integrity dropping into dangerous percentages, all while its weapons continued firing steadily, buying time for repair crews to reach the disabled shuttle. "They're going to lose that ship," I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone nearby. Grace Holloway, standing beside me on the observation deck, did not look away from the screen. "Maybe," she said, "but those 40 people get to go home either way." The Halberds Grace held its position until the disabled shuttle's engines were finally restored, allowing it to limp toward the safety of the fleet's main formation. Only then did the smaller vessel withdraw, its hull scorched and battered, but somehow, against every likelihood I could calculate, still intact. Later that evening, I asked Daniel about the decision, still processing what I had witnessed. "That ship's crew knew the risk," he said, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. "They made the choice themselves. Nobody ordered them to do it." "Would you have ordered it if they had hesitated?" He was silent for a long moment, staring out at the stars visible through the observation deck's reinforced window. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I'd like to think I wouldn't have needed to. That's the thing about my people, Sierra. We don't always wait for permission to do the right thing. Sometimes that gets people killed who didn't have to die. But sometimes it saves 40 people who would have died otherwise. I don't have a clean answer for you. I just have the outcome." I began to understand, during moments like these, that humanity's willingness toward sacrifice was not born from carelessness about their own lives, as I had initially assumed, but from an intense, almost overwhelming value placed on the lives of others, even strangers, even people from species that had feared and rejected them for centuries. It was a philosophy that seemed reckless by every standard Corvin culture had taught me, and yet I could not deny the results. Colonies that would have been abandoned under Standing Circle protocol were being saved. People who would have been left to die were coming home. As weeks turned into months, I found myself growing genuinely close to several members of the Ember Queen's crew, relationships that surprised me with their depth and sincerity. There was Owen Pierce, the tactical officer who had initially objected to diverting toward Farron's Hollow, who I came to understand was not opposed to compassion, but simply carried the heavy responsibility of weighing risk against reward for the entire crew, a burden that clearly wore on him even as he continued performing his duties with quiet dedication. There was a young pilot named Ellie Marsh, barely more than a cadet by Standing Circle standards, who had lost her entire family to an earlier conflict before joining the fleet, and who nonetheless approached every mission with a kind of stubborn, hopeful determination that reminded me, strangely, of young Corvin cadets I had trained alongside years earlier. She taught me some of the strange, physical games the crew played during downtime, laughing generously at my early, clumsy attempts to understand the rules. And there was Grace Holloway, whose steady, practical presence became something I relied on more than I initially realized. Someone who explained human customs to me without judgment, who answered my endless questions about their strange, contradictory culture with patience I had not expected to find among a species with such a violent reputation. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said to her one evening, as we worked together repairing a minor system malfunction in the ship's communications array, a task that had become something of a shared ritual between us over the preceding weeks. "Sure," Grace said, not looking up from her work. "Do you ever regret it, choosing this life, the danger, the losses, all of it?" Grace was quiet for a moment, her hands still moving through familiar, practiced motions across the exposed circuitry. Every single day, she said finally. And I'd choose it again tomorrow, every time without hesitation. That probably doesn't make sense to you. It does not, I admitted honestly. And yet, somehow, I am beginning to understand it anyway. She smiled at that, a small, tired expression that carried more warmth than any formal Corvine greeting ever had. That's about as good an answer as any of us have, Sira. Welcome to humanity, I guess. By the 4th month of my assignment, I had stopped thinking of the human crew as strange, unpredictable creatures to be cautiously observed, and started thinking of them, quietly, privately, as something closer to friends. It was a realization that would have shocked the younger version of myself, who had first opened that ancient distress channel, terrified and desperate, expecting rescue from monsters and finding, instead, something far more complicated, far more human, than any warning our ancestors had ever given us. But friendship, I would soon learn, came with a cost that I was not yet prepared to fully understand. The deeper the fleet pushed into contested territory, driving the Asheville swarm back system by system, the higher that cost would climb, and the more clearly I would come to see exactly what humanity meant when they spoke, so casually, so simply, about being willing to give everything for the people they had chosen to protect. The message arrived 6 months after I first joined the Ember Queen, delivered in the quiet hours of the ship's night cycle, and it changed everything about how I understood the price of the war we were fighting. The Asheville swarm, pushed back across a dozen systems, had regrouped for a final, desperate assault on a cluster of worlds near the heart of Standing Circle territory. Among those worlds was Corvith Prime, my homeworld, the place where I had been hatched, where my parents still lived, where every memory of my early life had been shaped by open skis and the sound of 1,000 wings moving together in the evening light. I read the tactical report 3 times before the reality of it fully settled into my mind. They are moving everything they have left, Daniel said, standing beside me in the Ember Queen's command center as the full scope of the swarm's final offensive became clear on the tactical display. Every ship, every resource. This is their last real push before they're finished as a coordinated force. And they are targeting Corvith Prime, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Along with 2 other worlds, Daniel confirmed. But yes, Corvith Prime is one of them. I did not need to ask what came next. I already knew, from months of watching this fleet operate, exactly what Daniel Cross would decide, and exactly what it would cost. We're splitting the fleet, he announced to the assembled command staff. 3 defensive positions, 1 for each targeted world. It means we'll be spread thin. It means some of these engagements will not have adequate support, but we are not letting any of these worlds fall if we can help it. Owen Pierce, ever the voice of tactical caution, raised the objection I expected. Sir, splitting our forces against a fleet this size means significant losses, possibly critical ones on all 3 fronts. We might lose ships we cannot replace. I'm aware, Daniel said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth now, replaced instead by a hard, focused determination I had rarely seen from him. We're doing it anyway. Assign the Ember Queen to Corvith Prime. I want our strongest defensive line protecting that world specifically. I looked at him sharply. Why Corvith Prime specifically? Daniel met my gaze directly, and for a moment, the exhaustion and weight of command showed clearly on his face. Because you're from there, Sira. Because in 6 months, you've become part of this crew, and I am not about to let your home burn while we're capable of preventing it. That's not strategy talking. That's just the truth. I did not have words for what I felt in that moment, a complicated mixture of gratitude and fear that left me unable to speak for several seconds. Around the command center, I noticed several other crew members nodding quietly in agreement, as if Daniel's decision required no further justification at all. The battle for Corvith Prime began 3 days later, and it was unlike anything I had witnessed in my time aboard the Ember Queen. The swarm's remaining forces, desperate and concentrated, threw themselves against our defensive line with an intensity that made the earlier battles at Haveth and Farron's Hollow seem almost gentle by comparison. Wave after wave of enemy ships broke against our formation, and though we held, the cost climbed steadily with each passing hour. I stood on the observation deck throughout most of the engagement, watching my homeworld's familiar blue and green curve hang suspended against the darkness, swarm ships burning in the space around it, human ships moving between them with the same brutal efficiency I had witnessed at Haveth all those months ago. But this time, I understood the cost in a way I had not fully grasped before. I knew the names attached to some of those ships now. I had eaten meals with their crews, laughed at their jokes, learned their strange, contradictory culture from the inside. 6 hours into the battle, disaster struck. A group of swarm ships, larger and more heavily armed than anything we had faced in previous engagements, broke through our secondary defensive line and began a direct approach toward Corvith Prime's largest population center, a coastal settlement called Thren's Rest, where nearly 200,000 Corvin lived. Our remaining forces were already stretched thin, engaged with the swarm's main formation, and there was no way to redirect enough ships to intercept the breakthrough in time. "We have maybe 8 minutes before they reach the settlement," Owen Pierce reported, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Nothing we've got can reach that position in time." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a fear more personal than anything I had experienced during the earlier battles. Thren's Rest was where my parents lived, where I had grown up, where thousands of families, entirely unaware of the danger closing in on them, were going about their evening as if it were any ordinary day. Daniel's jaw tightened as he studied the tactical display, calculating options that seemed to be narrowing with every passing second. "The Halberd's Grace is closest," he said finally. "Grace, do you copy?" Grace Holloway's voice came through the comm immediately, steady despite the obvious danger of what was being asked of her. "Copy, Commander. I see the position." "You're not going to reach them in time to stop the breakthrough with standard tactics," Daniel said, and I could hear something in his voice that told me he already understood the terrible math of what he was about to ask. "If you go in fast and hard, direct intercept, you might buy enough time for a second wave to arrive properly. But your shields won't hold against that many ships at close range for long." There was a pause over the comm, brief, but heavy, with unspoken understanding. "Then I'll make the time we need," Grace said simply. "Give the order, Commander." I wanted to protest, wanted to find some other option, some way to avoid what I already understood was coming. But there was no time, and worse, I knew with growing certainty that there was no other choice to make. 200,000 lives against one ship, against one crew who had chosen, freely and without hesitation, to accept exactly this kind of risk when they joined this fleet. "Do it," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Grace, come home if there's any way to manage it." "Always intend to, Commander," Grace replied. And then the channel fell silent as the Halberd's Grace broke away from the main formation and drove directly into the path of the swarm's breakthrough force. I watched the tactical display with a kind of frozen horror I had never experienced before, tracking the small, blinking icon representing Grace's ship as it closed the distance toward the much larger enemy formation. The Halberd's Grace opened fire the moment it came within range, weapons blazing against ships many times its size, buying precious seconds, while a second wave of human vessels scrambled to close the gap in our defensive line. For nearly 4 minutes, the Halberd's Grace held its position, absorbing damage that would have destroyed most standing circle vessels within the first 30 seconds of such an engagement. I watched the ship's shield percentage drop steadily on the display, watched hull integrity warnings begin flashing red, and felt every second stretch impossibly long, filled with a dread I did not know how to properly express. The second wave arrived with barely a minute to spare, human ships tearing into the swarm's breakthrough formation with the same relentless intensity I had witnessed so many times before. Together, they finally broke the enemy advance, scattering the remaining swarm ships back toward the main formation, saving Thren's Rest and everyone within it. But the cost had been real. "Halberd's Grace, report status," Daniel said into the comm, his voice tight with barely controlled worry. Silence answered him, stretching long enough that I felt my chest tight, with a fear I had not expected to feel so intensely for someone I had known such a relatively short time. Then finally, static crackled through the channel, followed by Grace's voice, weak but unmistakably alive. "Still here, Commander. Ship's not in great shape. Neither am I, honestly, but we're still here." The relief that flooded through the command center was immediate and visible, tension breaking across every face present, including, I realized with some surprise, my own. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly before opening them again with renewed focus. "Get her back to the fleet for repairs," he said. "Good work, all of you." The battle for Corvith Prime continued for another 11 hours before the swarm's forces finally broke and retreated, their coordinated assault shattered beyond any ability to reform. When the fighting finally ended, I stood on the observation deck once more, watching my homeworld hang peacefully against the darkness, its blue and green surface untouched, its people, including my own parents, safe within their homes, entirely unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. The cost, however, had not been small. 12 human ships had been lost across the 3 defensive engagements, along with crews I had never met but whose sacrifice had helped preserve worlds that were not their own, defended by people who owed us nothing beyond a simple, stubborn commitment to doing what they believed was right. I found Daniel later that evening in the ship's small observation lounge, staring out at the same view of Corvith Prime that had occupied my own thoughts for hours. 12 ships, I said quietly, sitting down beside him, for 3 worlds that are not even yours. 12 ships that made a choice, he corrected gently. Same as Grace did today, same as every single person who signs onto this fleet understands going in. We don't force anyone into that kind of sacrifice, Sierra. We just make sure everyone knows clearly what they might be asked to give. "Is it worth it?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could fully consider whether I truly wanted the answer. All of this loss, for worlds and people who feared you, who quarantined you, who wanted nothing to do with you for centuries. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars slowly wheel past the observation window. "You know," he said finally, "back where I'm from, we've got this saying. It's not about whether someone deserves saving. It's about whether you're the kind of person who can live with yourself if you didn't try. I think that's really the only answer I've got for you, and it's the only one I need." I thought about my parents, safe in Thren's Rest, entirely unaware of how close disaster had come to their door. I thought about Grace Holloway, alive but wounded, having offered her own life without hesitation to protect people she had never even met. I thought about 12 ships and however many crew members who would not be returning home, their sacrifice folded quietly into the ongoing cost of a war that was not originally theirs to fight. "Thank you," I said finally, the words feeling inadequate against everything I actually meant by them. "For my home, for my parents, for all of it." Daniel gave a small, tired smile, the expression carrying the weight of everything the day had cost, but none of the regret I might have expected. "That's what we're here for, Sierra. Every single time, no matter the cost. That's just who we are." Outside the observation window, Corvith Prime continued its slow, peaceful rotation, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped destruction, protected by a fleet of strangers who had chosen, again and again, to give everything they had for worlds and people that history had once told them to fear. The Asheville Swarm's final defeat came almost a year after that desperate call I sent from Haveth Station, and by the time it finally happened, I had changed so completely that the young, frightened signal officer I once was felt like someone from an entirely different life. The last major engagement took place at what had once been the Swarm's primary staging ground, a dense cluster of asteroid fields the humans had nicknamed the Boneyard, for reasons I did not fully understand until I saw it myself, littered as it was with the wreckage of countless ships from both sides of the long conflict. The combined fleet, human and standing circle vessels working together for the first time in true coordinated formation, finally broke the Swarm's remaining forces beyond any possibility of recovery. I watched that final battle from the Ember Queen's command center, standing beside Daniel Cross, Grace Holloway, Owen Pierce, and Ellie Marsh, people who had become, over the course of that difficult year, something far closer to family than colleagues. When the last Swarm capital ship finally fell, breaking apart in a silent shower of debris against the darkness. The command center erupted into a mixture of exhausted relief and quiet, unguarded emotion that surprised me even after everything I had already learned about human nature. Grace Holloway, still carrying a slight limp from her injuries months earlier, allowed herself to be pulled into an embrace by Ellie Marsh, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure. Owen Pierce simply closed his eyes and exhaled a long, slow breath, the tension of command finally beginning to ease from his shoulders after so many months of constant vigilance. Daniel stood quietly, watching the debris field with an expression I had learned to recognize over our time together, one that carried both genuine relief and the deeper, more complicated weight of remembering everyone who had not lived to see this moment. "It is over," I said softly, still finding the reality of it difficult to fully process. "This part is," Daniel agreed. "There's always another part, Sierra, always something else out there. But yeah, this particular nightmare is finished." In the months that followed, I watched something remarkable happen across Standing Circle territory. A shift in perspective that unfolded slowly but unmistakably, world by world, species by species. The reports that once painted humanity as violent, unpredictable monsters began quietly disappearing from official archives, replaced by updated assessments that struggled, awkwardly at times, to reconcile old fears with the undeniable reality of what humanity had actually done for the galaxy during its darkest hour. Standing Circle Command formally requested my continued service as a liaison, this time in a permanent diplomatic capacity, tasked with helping negotiate the terms of an entirely new relationship between our peoples, one built not on quarantine and fear, but on genuine partnership. I accepted without hesitation, understanding by then that I had a unique perspective few others in the Standing Circle could offer, having lived alongside humanity long enough to understand both their contradictions and their consistency. Negotiations were not always simple. Old fears do not disappear overnight, and many within the Standing Circle remained deeply uncomfortable with the idea of fully welcoming a species their ancestors had specifically chosen to isolate. I attended council sessions where elderly delegates from various member worlds argued passionately against expanding humanity's role beyond simple military alliance, citing the very same old reports and warnings that had once shaped my own initial fears. "They fight without proper restraint," argued one delegate during a particularly heated session, a representative from a species called the Threll who had lost heavily to the swarm before the human fleet's arrival. "Their tactics are reckless. Their culture values sacrifice in ways that suggest a fundamental disregard for their own safety. Is this truly the kind of influence we wish to invite deeper into our society?" I found myself standing to respond before I had fully decided to speak, the words coming from someplace deeper than careful diplomatic calculation. "I have lived among them for a year," I said. "I have seen their reckless tactics save children who would otherwise have died. I have watched their disregard for their own safety translate into strangers giving everything they had to protect worlds that were never their responsibility to defend. Perhaps what our ancestors called dangerous was simply courage that our own culture had not yet learned how to properly value." The council chamber fell silent at that, and though the debate continued for many more sessions afterward, I noticed a subtle shift beginning that day, a gradual softening in how many delegates spoke about humanity, informed increasingly by direct testimony from officers and civilians who had actually lived through the war alongside the human fleet, rather than relying solely on centuries-old fear passed down through cautious, isolated tradition. Nearly 2 years after that first desperate call from Haveth Station, I stood in a newly constructed memorial garden on Corvith Prime, my homeworld, alongside Daniel Cross, Grace Holloway, and several other members of what had once been simply the Ember Queen's crew, now recognized across Standing Circle territory as heroes of the war's final, decisive campaign. The garden had been built to honor everyone lost during the conflict, Corvain and human names listed together on the same simple stone markers, a quiet, permanent acknowledgement that our two peoples had bled together for the same cause. "It is strange," I said, walking slowly alongside Daniel through the carefully tended paths. To think that 2 years ago, I believed I was calling monsters to save us from monsters. Daniel smiled, though it carried a certain thoughtful weight that had become familiar to me over our long partnership. "Funny how that works out sometimes," he said. "Turns out the monsters our people warned each other about were just people who'd learned to survive somewhere harder than most places ever get. Doesn't make us gentle. Just means we know exactly what it costs to protect something worth protecting." I thought about everything that had happened since that first terrified transmission, the battle at Haveth, my strange, difficult adjustment to life aboard a human vessel, the desperate defense of Thren's Rest, and the long, careful work of rebuilding trust between two peoples who had spent centuries believing the worst about each other. None of it had been simple. None of it had come without cost. But standing there, surrounded by names honoring both Corvain and human sacrifice equally, I understood something I could not have grasped that first terrified night aboard Haveth Station. Courage did not look the same in every species. Some cultures expressed it through careful restraint and measured precision, while others expressed it through loud laughter in the face of danger, and an almost reckless willingness to give everything for people they had only just met. Neither approach was inherently superior. They were simply different answers to the same fundamental question every intelligent species eventually had to face. What are you willing to risk, and for whom, when the moment finally demands it? "What happens now?" I asked, as we reached the garden's central point, where a simple, elegant sculpture depicted a Corvain and a human figure standing back to back, weapons lowered, facing outward together against whatever might come next. "Now," Daniel said, "we figure out how to actually live together properly for the first time in a long while. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, probably more arguments in council chambers than either of us would like. But also, I hope, more days like this one, where we get to stand somewhere peaceful and just breathe for a while." I looked out across the garden, filled with quiet visitors from both our peoples, some standing solemnly before memorial markers, others simply walking together, talking, laughing softly in the warm afternoon light of my homeworld sun. It was a small, ordinary scene, and yet it represented something extraordinary when measured against the centuries of fear and isolation that had preceded it. Word had begun spreading across the wider galaxy by then, carried through trade routes and diplomatic channels, stories of the Deathworlder fleet that had arrived when hope seemed entirely lost, that had fought with a ferocity no one expected, and a compassion even fewer had anticipated, that had bled and sacrificed for worlds and peoples who had once locked their door and thrown away the key. Other species, hearing these stories, began reaching out cautiously toward the old quarantine frequencies themselves, curious whether the monsters they had also been warned about might, in truth, be something far more complicated and far more worth knowing. I did not know, standing in that quiet memorial garden, everything the future would hold for the growing partnership between humanity and the wider galaxy. I did not know what new dangers might eventually arise, what new tests of courage and sacrifice still waited somewhere beyond the horizon. But I understood, with a certainty I had not possessed that terrified night aboard Haveth Station, that whatever came next, we would not face it alone. "Thank you," I said quietly, watching the afternoon light shift gently across the garden's carefully tended paths, "for answering a call that our people had no right to expect anyone would answer." Daniel looked at me, his expression carrying the same warm, direct honesty I had come to rely on over 2 difficult, transformative years. "Thank you for making the call in the first place," he said. "Took courage, reaching out to something you've been taught your whole life to fear. That's not so different from what we do, honestly. Maybe we're not as different as either of our people once believed." Standing there together, beneath the peaceful sky of my homeworld, surrounded by evidence of both the terrible cost and the profound value of the choice I had made that desperate night, I found myself believing, fully and completely, that he was right. The galaxy had once called them monsters, dangerous and unpredictable, a species best left quarantined behind old fear and older warnings. But I had lived among them long enough to know the truth beneath that old, mistaken reputation. They were not monsters at all. They were simply the ones willing to answer, when everyone else had already given up hope of anyone answering at all. And for that, across 1,000 worlds slowly learning to set aside their old fears, they would be remembered always as exactly what they truly were. The galaxy's saviors.